Welcome to Truthiverse, a podcast for awakening minds who want to go deep. If you're vibing with the show, please do hit the like and subscribe buttons, and if you could take a few seconds to leave me a review on Apple or Spotify, it's actually super helpful for ranking the show up and getting my work out to more people. And remember, when you do, take a screenshot and send it to me on Instagram for a free thank you gift. For other ways you can support me, check out the show notes. I've listed ways you can do that there. Stay cool. All right, welcome to this episode of the show. I'm going to actually take you for a little stroll down memory lane with this one. I'm re-airing an old episode of a podcast that I used to run with my partner Amy, and it was called Global Freedom Movement back in the day, many years ago, when we were running episodes through 2014 and 2015. So this interview that I'm going to share with you is a very interesting conversation with world homeopathy expert Dr. Isaac Golden. I just wanted to give it a little preface to say, for those of you who've been really following along or doing your homework, obviously we know that germ theory is overwhelmingly nonsense. We have already established that there is no real credible scientific evidence to support the belief in so-called viruses. So I just wanted to say, I'm acknowledging that before we start the episode, because obviously that's going to come up. I don't know where Dr. Golden is in terms of his, perception or awareness of things at this point. I just wanted to say, don't email me or write comments about, you're enabling germ theory, this kind of stuff. So just look past any of those types of mentions, and you'll find it is still a very interesting conversation. And that's why I'm resharing it, particularly for, I have in mind, probably because I have a little one myself, parents, and particularly young parents who have a little one, who are maybe just starting to wake up to things and find out what's going on in the world, and starting to look for safe, natural alternatives that are health supporting, and, starting to look away from pharma for some solutions and answers. This is the kind of conversation I would probably be directing them to. So maybe as you're listening to it, think of someone who might be in that situation who could benefit from this information. Please overlook any of the sort of germ theory type references or allusions. And yeah, you'll find, I think, that it's still a very valid, relevant interview conversation with some very powerful information in there, and some pretty eye-opening information. I listened back to some of it today, and I thought to myself, I'm really glad we did this chat with Dr. Isaac Golden. So, with that little preface and disclaimer, welcome to this week's episode, and enjoy the conversation. This week we are joined by Dr. Isaac Golden, world-leading expert in homeopathy, homeoprophylaxis. Can't wait to chat and get right into the nitty-gritty and the state of play currently. It's become a very it's a very topical thing at the moment, because the governments around the world, particularly in Australia and America, are really pushing the vaccine thing very hard, and people are starting to get more and more interested in alternatives that may be safer, less of a concern, and healthier, so on and so forth. So we couldn't have found someone better to talk to about that, and we're very pleased with ourselves for getting Isaac on the show this week. Isaac, thanks heaps for joining us.
No, that's a pleasure, Brendan and Amy. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to it very much, because, as you say, it is a very topical conversation point at the moment, and some of the legislation that's been both passed or proposed to be passed in America and Australia is really quite draconian. And one of the things that we can say about the Australian legislation, for those who aren't familiar with it, they're basically threatening parents with the loss of financial benefits if they don't vaccinate their children. One of the things it raises is questions of equity and open and honest access, because we know that there's not a doctor in this country that would give a personal guarantee about the safety of vaccines. We know that governments in countries like Australia have to indemnify vaccine manufacturers. We know that 20 countries in the world have vaccine damage compensation schemes, which have paid out billions of dollars, literally. Australia, by the way, is one of 3 developed countries in the world that doesn't have a vaccine damage compensation scheme. We know all of these things and that risks have been quantified, but yet they're still coercing parents into vaccinating using a procedure which has benefits, but it also has risks. And they're not prepared to cover the parents to protect them against the risks, but yet they're trying to force them into doing an invasive medical procedure. Well, you know, at the end of the Second World War, we had something called the Nuremberg trials. And out of that came certain medical conventions because of the dreadful things that the Nazis did in the camps to people, medical doctors who did experiments. And we had laws passed, international laws, about people not being forced to undergo invasive medical procedures without full consent. And unfortunately, these sort of laws are now starting to infringe on those international commitments. It's very serious.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, even in, I mean, we're talking mainly about Australia today, and but it's also rampant around the world. I was reading an article about Turkey the other day about a case that was in, I think it was the Supreme Court or a High Court in Turkey, that's basically ruled that vaccines, they can overrule and just not even ask parents. Parents have no say there anymore because of this landmark case, that they can just vaccinate these kids without parental.
Yeah. See, most of what we're going to talk about today is to do with homeoprophylaxis. So it's not an anti-vaccination talk, but it has to be put in context.
Yes.
And the context is that, you know, people are being coerced to do something, and they're not being forced to do this really on the basis of good science or good medical science. You see, the claim seems to be that unvaccinated children put vaccinated children at risk. Otherwise, there'd be no purpose in forcing children to be vaccinated.
Yeah.
But this actually scientifically is not correct. In fact, there's a lot of material coming out showing that vaccinated children and adults are just as likely, in fact, in some cases more so, to threaten other people, whether vaccinated or not, with exposure to the organism. There was a very interesting study done in primates recently to do with the whooping cough vaccine, because in Australia we changed some years ago from a whole cell vaccine to what they call an acellular vaccine. And what this research showed is that the change was made to try and reduce potential side effects. We knew that the acellular vaccine wasn't quite as effective, but it was meant to be safer. But what this latest research has shown, and been published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, that actually the new acellular vaccine, it takes longer to work its way through the system. The system doesn't deal with it as quickly. Therefore, there's more chance of people who have received the acellular vaccine passing the organism on to other people than previously with the whole cell vaccine. So the premise, the entire premise about trying to force people to vaccinate, scientifically actually does not stand up. But the thing that I'm most concerned about talking to you and your audience is about homeoprophylaxis, which has been used since 1798 to actually immunize people or protect people against targeted infectious diseases. So vaccines were first used in 1796. Homeoprophylaxis was first used 1798. They've both been around for over 200 years. And we have a lot of evidence, both long-term historical evidence, evidence in short-term epidemic situations, evidence in long-term use. And now in the last 15 years, we've been able to get a significant amount of evidence from governments around the world who employ doctors to administer homeopathic immunisation in millions of people. And I'm sure this is something that many, many people don't know. In fact, I'm sure most politicians in Australia and America don't know, but yet, you know, they make laws on the basis of what they're told, and what they're told is a very small part of the total picture.
Yeah. I'm fascinated to know about how those programs are playing out and what countries are doing them, and what kind of results they're getting. If you don't mind going down that road
Yep.
briefly.
So I became interested in this topic 30 years ago. And when I first started in Australia, I designed a 5 to 6 year program for parents to use who didn't want to vaccinate their children. And it's changed a few times over that period. I think I've had 4 or 5 different versions of the 5 to 6 year program. But basically, its aim is to give parents options for what we regard as normal diseases here. In overseas countries, they're often exposed to severe epidemics of certain diseases. They can be seasonal or they can come, out of the blue. Unlike Australia, we don't really have that massive epidemic situation, apart from flu, I suppose, every year, which always is heralded with with calls for, great mass immunisation or vaccination programs because a deadly flu is coming from Europe, and every year it's even more serious. But in countries where I've studied the use of homeoprophylaxis, in particular Cuba and India, the governments there have been using prophylaxis programs. Now, unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish, because I do know that in South America, there are a lot of medical practitioners who are also homeopaths, and that homeoprophylaxis is used quite extensively throughout the rest of South America as well. But that's the data I don't have. But let's go to Cuba first. I was first invited there to speak at a conference in December 2008. Now, unbeknown to me, they'd been using my protocols, my homeoprophylaxis protocols, in a very large intervention against a disease called leptospirosis. Now, leptospirosis is a bacterial disease which is carried through water. Usually it's passed from rat urine, but other animal urine as well sometimes, into water and then to humans. So in Cuba, the most dangerous time for leptospirosis is the hurricane season, because that's when there's a lot of infrastructure damage and a lot of standing water. That's usually from October, November and December each year. Now, in 2007, they had a very bad hurricane, which did a lot of damage, particularly to the 3 eastern provinces of Cuba, Las Tunas, Holguin and Granma. And they noticed that there was a big spike in the cases of leptospirosis. So what they did at the Finlay Institute, and the Finlay Institute is a WHO accredited vaccine manufacturer, but they'd been experimenting with some small interventions. They decided that they would use homeoprophylaxis on the entire population of those 3 provinces,
Wow.
2.2 million people. And when we look at the data, unfortunately, we haven't got nice little graphs here, but when you look at the graphs, which have all been published, you'll see that within 2 weeks of that intervention, the epidemic broke in those 3 provinces. But in the rest of the country, it wasn't as severe, but it kept going until January, which is the beginning of the dry season. And that's when the cases fall anyway. Then the next year, in 2008, it was even more dramatic, because they actually had 3 hurricanes in that year. It was a dreadful year, one of the worst years they've had. And in fact, when I got there in December 2008, the food production of the whole country had only just started to recover.
Wow.
They'd actually had people in Havana, which wasn't as badly hit as the other end of the country, encouraged anyone who had a little bit of a garden space to plant quick-growing food to feed the whole country, because there was massive infrastructure damage. Now, when you look at the data, they did another intervention in those 3 provinces in a higher strength this time. And when you look at the data, you can see the incidence in those 3 provinces, it hardly changed at all. Whereas in the rest of the country, there was a huge spike, which came down again in January, as is always predicted. And that was dramatic evidence of the effectiveness. Now, the person who led those interventions, Dr. Gustavo Bracho, I've been back to Cuba 4 times in total. In 2012, he and I sat down and we went through all of the potential confounders. Now, confounders are things which may cause the result to be different. which may cause the result to appear to be one thing, but when you look at other things. So, for example, if everyone had been vaccinated against the disease, that would be a massive confounder, because that, of course, could affect the number of cases. But and by the way, everyone wasn't. I think there was about 2% of the population had received a vaccine of those provinces. So we went through and we looked at all of the confounders in 2008 for that particular intervention, and demonstrated quite clearly that not only did it appear to be massively successful, but in fact it actually was. And on the basis of that intervention, in 2010, when we had the big scare with swine flu around the world, the Cuban government instructed the Finlay Institute to immunise the whole country against swine flu, everyone above the age of 12 months. And in fact, that involved over 9.8 million people.
Wow.
Once again, when you look at the data, they also at the same time immunised against pneumococcal disease. When you look at the data, you can see there was a drop from the normal incidence of flu and pneumococcal disease, which usually sits between 5,000 and 6,000 per year. There was a drop of 1,000 in deaths that year. So it made a massive difference for that one the intervention occurred. Then last year, when I was back there in September of 2014, Dr. Bracho and I put together a history of homeoprophylaxis in Cuba, and it showed that they'd used programs not only for leptospirosis and the swine flu and pneumococcal disease, but also for dengue fever, hepatitis A, cholera, and a viral disease that causes conjunctivitis. And every time they'd put a program into place, they had very clear and positive results. So the reason why this sort of evidence is so important is that these people are orthodox medical practitioners and scientists. They're not crazy, loony, naturopathic, homeopathic types doing things that, that they're probably making up as much as anything else. These are very carefully orthodox trained, 6 years in medical school sort of people doing programs sponsored by governments. And so it adds a tremendous amount of legitimacy to the findings that we have. Now in India, I had my first visit to India in April this year. For many years I'd wanted to go because I'd heard of some very large interventions that have been done there, and particularly the largest I've ever heard of in the world, which was back in 99, 2000, 2001 in Andhra Pradesh province. Now, Andhra Pradesh back then had a population of 87 million people. And they immunised in those 3 years children aged 15 years and less against Japanese encephalitis, because they're the age group that Japanese encephalitis is most likely to attack. So they actually homeopathically immunised around 20 million children over those 3 years, in each of the 3 years. And what we found was that the incidence in 1999, there were about just over 1,100 cases and over 300 deaths. By 2003, both were zero.
Wow.
And we know that it wasn't, we know it wasn't just coincidental, because we looked at other provinces in India which didn't use homeoprophylaxis. You see, this is where the confounders come in again. If every other state in India had fallen to zero, it wouldn't prove a thing. But when you looked at the incidence of Japanese encephalitis in the other states and saw that they hadn't changed dramatically, then it showed the effect of the particular intervention in Andhra Pradesh. Now, I also went to Kerala State, where they have something called a REACH program, which is a wonderful system embedded in their orthodox medical system. What they do, they have they call them cells in different parts of the state, of a group of doctors. And as soon as there's a report of a concerning infectious disease starting, it might be dengue fever, it might be cholera, scarlet fever, anything like that, starting in a particular area of the state, the doctors in that cell will go to the area, they'll interview the patients, they'll take the symptom picture of the disease in those patients and work out the remedy that's needed for treatment, but also the remedy that's needed for disease prevention. And they'll implement the intervention there. They'll then let members of all of the other cells throughout the whole state know what's happening in their particular area, so that people in the other areas of the state can either implement a homeoprophylaxis program if they feel they might be exposed to this soon, or at least they know as soon as they need to do something, they can do it very quickly. They're prepared. And you see, this is one of the wonderful things about homeoprophylaxis in epidemic situations. Unlike vaccines, which will often take 6 to 12 months to develop and bring into use, a homeoprophylaxis remedy, even against a brand new infectious disease, can actually be brought into action within 2 weeks. And some people have asked me, well, why didn't we use it for Ebola? Well, we tried to. In fact, the Cuban government had a team of medical specialists ready to go to Africa to assist, and they were refused entry. There were 4 doctors from Europe and the European Union and 4 doctors from America, homeopathic doctors, who separately went to Africa, and they were refused permission to practice, to treat homeopathically or to use homeoprophylaxis. So unfortunately, there are great forces at play which don't necessarily want the benefit of this system to be known to other people.
Yeah. Can I actually I want to come back to what you just mentioned about how the homeoprophylactic formulas can be generated so quickly to respond to a situation, whereas the vaccines take months and months. But what is it about the procedure that allows it to be done so quickly?
Good question. Homeopathy in general is based on 2 principles: the principle of similars and the principle of minimum dose. And those principles apply to both homeopathic treatment as well as disease prevention. So when we're dealing with an infectious disease, well, let me give you a little example from the first time it was used by the founder of homeopathy back in 1798. Let me tell you the story because it'll feed into your answer. Dr. Hahnemann was treating cases of scarlet fever. There was a mini epidemic, if you like, in his area of Germany at the time. And he was treating cases of scarlet fever, and he found that the homeopathic remedy belladonna was really specific and he had very, very good results in treatment. Now, coincidentally, he'd been treating a young girl in a household in the area with belladonna for a totally different issue. This had been months before the disease moved into the area. Actually, the other members of her household became infected with scarlet fever, and she didn't. And Hahnemann realized that he'd been giving her the remedy that he was using to treat the epidemic. And so he started giving doses of belladonna to people who had not yet been exposed. And he found that it actually protected them. So this was the first example of the law of similars being used to select a remedy whose symptom picture fitted the symptom picture of the disease. And we know, based on the law of similars, that a substance which can cause symptoms in a healthy person can prevent similar symptoms in a previously unexposed person. So belladonna, in provings, in testing on healthy people, can cause symptoms which are similar to scarlet fever in healthy people. Therefore, they can prevent symptoms similar to scarlet fever if given to healthy people before exposure. So in other words, in Kerala, for example, these doctors would go and, let's say it was an outbreak of dengue fever. Now, most of the time they find a remedy, Eupatorium perfoliatum, fits the early symptoms of dengue fever very, very well, but not always. So they would check the symptoms that the patients of the first outbreak were experiencing. And if they found that those symptoms match the remedy Eupatorium perfoliatum, then that would be the remedy they'd use. If, on the other hand, they didn't match and they matched a different remedy, say Bryonia, then they would use that. This is called a genus epidemicus remedy. In other words, it's the knowledge of the epidemic, what's peculiar to the particular outbreak. Now, in homeoprophylaxis, we also can use remedies we call nosodes. Now, these are remedies initially prepared from molecules of the bacteria or the virus which is causing the outbreak. And what we can do, we don't need to go through extensive laboratory manipulations. These remedies can be prepared by homeopaths on the ground in an emergency situation if necessary. So, for example, if you were preparing a nosode against whooping cough, you'd get sputum from someone with clinically diagnosed whooping cough. You'd add 1 drop of that, 99 drops of alcohol and water, and succuss, which is the violent agitation against a firm surface of the vial containing the liquid. You take 1 drop of that, 99, succuss. 1 drop, 99, succuss. So this is how homeopathic medicines are prepared in general. By the time you've gone through the 12th stage of that, we pass something in physics called Avogadro's number, which means, in theory, there's no molecules of the original substance left. Now, we generally use potencies much higher than that. So we know that it's impossible, for example, to get the disease from the actual remedies themselves because there's no molecules left. But what it means is, in terms of preparing medicines, if we want to use nosodes instead of the genus epidemicus remedies, and there's various reasons for doing that, they can be prepared very quickly. In the leptospirosis example, for example, the Cubans were able to obtain the 4 strains of the disease that were circulating at the time and prepare the nosodes. They actually use a somewhat different form of medicine as well. They use a complex of the nosodes and genus epidemicus remedies. They're a bit different to the way a lot of classical homeopaths practice, but they have brilliant results. And they were able to get that, and they were able to manufacture the remedy within 2 weeks. And this is a huge advantage because in certain epidemics, if you can't get a vaccine there for 6 months, the epidemics pass through the area. It's done the damage it's going to do. So it's this inexpensive and really flexible form of disease prevention, particularly in dangerous epidemics. It's a real blessing to have that.
Well, the main epidemics that we undergo nowadays that we hear about is the flu. There's the bird flu, the swine flu, the this flu, the that flu. And, we were writing an article recently about the flu vaccine, how it's manufactured and all those kinds of things. And one of the things that I realized was the guesswork that's involved with it all. It's basically like the flu psychic has to figure out, which flu is going to attack which part of the world and then hope that happens. And then and only then may the vaccine be effective for some.
Yep.
Because it's all, it's all guesswork. Okay, it's winter in the northern hemisphere. This is what flu we've had. Okay, hopefully that's what they'll get down in the southern hemisphere. So fingers crossed. And we'll just spend all this money on the research and making it, and 6 months later, those strains didn't hit Australia. Whoops, that was a waste of money.
Yeah, so it's a very good point. It actually raises a number of issues. You see, the vaccine model relies on a very close match between the antigen that's used, or the disease material that's used in the vaccine, and the antigen that's circulating in the community. That's also one reason why there's been a very big spike in whooping cough cases in America and Australia, because the strain of whooping cough is changing in those communities, and therefore the vaccine doesn't match as well. You see, the vaccine is designed to stimulate antibody production, but if you stimulate different antibodies to the antibodies needed to deal with the particular strain that's in the community, they won't work so well. This is one reason why the effectiveness of the flu vaccine is only around 40%, 60% at the very most. So it's one of the least effective vaccines that we find in clinical use.
Mm.
Now, one of the advantages of homeopathy is it doesn't work on that, using that paradigm or using that method. So it works on the basis of symptom similarity, as I mentioned before, the principle of similars. So if you have two different strains of anything, whooping cough, the flu, whatever, if they produce similar symptoms, then you'll find that the same remedy will have similar levels of effectiveness, even if it's a different strain, because what's important with homeopathy is the match between the symptoms of the remedy and the symptoms of the strain that's in the community. And if they're similar, the remedy will still have a protective effect. Now, in Australia, I generally use each year what we call a triple nosode. So in other words, that's a preparation of one remedy, but it has three different strains, the three major strains of flu in it, and the strains that have different symptom pictures. And I've tended to, I've been using this for 25 years basically, and have found it very effective. Apparently, that combination gives sufficient similarity to whichever strain comes that it's going to be a pretty good match. You could also work out for different remedies, different areas or regions in each country, once you've had a number of cases of flu each year, what the genus epidemicus remedy is. And once again, that can change from year to year. And you might find one year it's eupatorium again, another year it might be phosphorus, another year it might be arsenicum, or you might have, sometimes you get two or three remedies that seem to be common in the outbreak of the flu rather than just a single one. So you see, we have flexibility. And a practitioner who knows what they're doing can actually use the knowledge that they have of both the nosodes and what's been found with genus epidemicus and what they've seen in their own patients, of course, as well, which is very important to determine the best way to go about it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I really like the idea of how adaptable it is so appealing. You would think that given the cost effectiveness of it and the flexibility of it, that the pragmatists entrenched in certain institutions might see some merit in this sort of an approach.
Well, you know, the thing that I would love to do is to sit down with someone from Treasury, not from the health department, because they won't listen, but from Treasury, and point out, for example, that when the swine flu hit back in 2010, Australia spent $200 million buying swine flu vaccination. Most of that was unused. Now, we could have homeopathically immunised the entire country for around $10 million.
Wow.
And that's everyone. And the one advantage of that is that there'd be no side effects. No one would get the disease from the remedy, and no one would get side effects from the remedy. So once again, the cost savings would be multiplied. Now, I would love to be able to sit down with, as I said, someone from Treasury or someone from the finance department and just explain to them, you know, this would save your budget hundreds of millions of dollars every year by doing this. It would reduce the burden of chronic disease in the country. You know, one of the nice things about India when I was there, I actually went there for just over 2 weeks, and my aim in going there was to actually try and collect data and to meet with the people who undertook that very, very large homeoprophylaxis intervention in Andhra Pradesh that I mentioned earlier, in 20 million children. In fact, I had the pleasure of meeting those doctors, or some of them, who undertook the intervention, who were the ones who guided it. But I also had the great pleasure of meeting the Deputy Director of CCRH. Now, CCRH is the Central Council for Research in Homeopathy in India. It actually is the main government-funded research organisation for homeopathy, and it has a staff of around 1,000 people. Now, there probably aren't 1,000 accredited homeopaths in Australia. So mainly this is homeopathic medical practitioners. And the deputy director and I sat down and talked for about 4 hours, and we came to an agreement that we would like to try and conduct some research together. And I've sent him a number of proposals. In fact, 7 different research proposals. And one of the aims of it is to actually quantify the potential reduction in the burden of chronic disease in India if this program was used, as well as quantify the cost savings to the Indian government. We could do that in Australia. We could do that sort of analysis and study in Australia. But of course, the way the politicians are listening to a very narrowly focused group of people at the moment, it's highly unlikely to happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, and then you've got the NHMRC who released a report recently on homeopathy, which I'm sure you could touch on.
He's already laughing.
I'll do more than touch on it.
Please do. Unleash.
What was it? Yeah, one of the interesting things in India, I actually gave 7 presentations in 4 states while I was there. I was going to say I went over there to try and learn, but I ended up, they kept on asking me to do presentations. So fortunately, I'd taken all my PowerPoints over and was quickly modifying talks for the next night. But one thing which every place I went to, they asked me about was the NHMRC report. So that is a report which has been circulated around the world.
Wow.
And it's very interesting because, in my opinion, it's an example of it. There's an old saying in statistics: if you want the right answer, ask the wrong question. And this is exactly what they did.
Yeah.
Now, back in 2011, the NHMRC came to the conclusion that homeopathy was ineffective. They based that conclusion on work done in the United Kingdom House of Commons report on homeopathy that had been finalised and published a little time before that, which in turn relied on an article which had been published in The Lancet in 2005 by Shang and Edders and others. So all of this, the NHMRC report in 2015 can be directly traced back to an article in Lancet in 2005. So let me talk about that just very briefly first. The article in Lancet, which claimed to prove that homeopathy was ineffective, what the authors did there, they selected 120 orthodox medical studies and they matched them, which were matched with 120 studies of, 110 studies of orthodox medicine and 110 studies of homeopathy. So there were 220 studies altogether. And the aim was that they were going to make a comparison between the 2 groups of studies. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, in the end, the conclusion that they reached, and it took people 2 years to actually uncover this because the way they published the material was quite deceitful. What they did, they reduced those 210 studies down to 9. So in other words, they cherry-picked 9 of those 220 studies to reach the conclusion that they wanted to find, which was that homeopathy was ineffective. Now, experts in epidemiology, I mean, I know a bit about statistics, but I'm not, an expert in epidemiology. But experts in epidemiology, when they finally, after 2 years, were able to unlock all the codes and find out exactly what these people had done, they reanalyzed the data, and it was actually positive to homeopathy. But in the meantime, the House of Commons report, which was set up by a group of people in the British Parliament opposed to homeopathy, they drew almost totally on this flawed Lancet report. The NHMRC drew almost totally on the flawed British House of Commons report. And by the way, the British House of Commons did not accept the findings of their own report. There were actually 13 people on this so-called health expert committee, none of whom had any knowledge of homeopathy, basically. Only 3 of the 13 actually voted for their findings. 1 person voted against. The other 9 didn't even turn up. So that's how rigorous the actual analysis was by the House of Commons committee. But anyway, the NHMRC decided on the basis of these 2 flawed bits of non-evidence, in a way, that homeopathy was ineffective. And so what they, in a way, have done is design a procedure, a statistical and analytical procedure, to validate their conclusion that they reached secretly initially in 2011. It came out in 2012 that homeopathy was ineffective. So what they actually did, and this is in their own material, they excluded from their analysis any consideration of health, which is interesting when you're trying to evaluate the benefit of a health modality. They excluded from their analysis anything to do with the prevention of disease, not just infectious disease, but disease prevention in general. They excluded any assessment of the cost benefit of homeopathy. They excluded anything to do with the quality of homeopathic medicines. And finally, they excluded anything to do with the safety of homeopathic medicines. Now, basically, when you include all those things, it's what's called a health technology assessment. They actually claimed in their report that their analysis was similar to a health technology assessment. It wasn't. It couldn't have been further from the fact, because they had, by definition, excluded all but one element of a health technology assessment. So the one thing they had left was an assessment of how effective homeopathy was in treating certain conditions. They then kept their exclusion going, and they excluded, by definition, most of the evidence available looking at homeopathy treating these different conditions, and they were left with a subset of randomized controlled trials. They didn't even accept all of the randomized controlled trials that were available. And then they came out with as part of their conclusions, was that there were no high quality randomized controlled trials showing evidence of effectiveness of homeopathy. And even that statement was incorrect, because when you look at the body called Optum Research that they paid to actually examine the raw material, and when you go through the Optum report in detail, which I actually have done, took weeks or so, and go through all of the different studies, there are actually 298 different studies that they note. Some of those came from the one report, but they were 2 different aspects of the one report. When you look at all of those, there actually were high quality studies that supported homeopathy. Now, the NHMRC also put in another cut-off point. They said, we only will accept studies where there's more than 150 participants. And most of those studies had fewer, but there still were high-quality studies that were positive for homeopathy that had more than 150 participants. So you see, the whole NHMRC report is really a textbook of how not to do scientific analysis. Or, once again, it's a textbook example. If you want the right answer, ask the wrong question, because that's what they did.
What came of the scientists responsible for that piece of shoddy research?
Well, they would have been congratulated by all their scientific colleagues on a job well done.
Pat on the back. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I was looking at the public consult.
No, look, that's not, to be honest with you, that's not, I'm being a little bit flippant, but it's not entirely true, because the NHMRC actually commissioned 3 independent reviewers, presumably experts in analysis, to give a view about the research that they'd done, the opinions of those three experts were actually obtained under freedom of information legislation, and two of the three experts said that the NHMRC should not have made the findings that they did. So, you know, serious people are not happy with it, and we'll see where it goes. The story about this report has not finished.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it seems like it was, I mean, it could be taking a little bit far, but it could almost seem to be a planned strategy to take credit away from homeoprophylaxis for what they had planned with this whole compulsory vaccination thing. You know, like discredit the homeopathy first, and then okay, we'll say now you have to vaccinate your kids. And oh, look, there's no other option because homeopathy is completely, you know, ineffective and useless.
Look, I actually don't think it was specifically designed to work alongside the current vaccination issues that are being circulated, but it is being used, and you're quite right in that regard. But this started long before you know, any of the recent things in Australia took place, which really have been this, you know, no jab, no play initiatives by the Murdoch press started probably 2013, maybe a little bit before that. So certainly this is very comfortable for them. They can use this if homeopathic immunisation is mentioned. I mean, they don't mention it. The government doesn't mention it to any extent, except to say, quite incorrectly, that major homeopathic associations around the world say that homeoprophylaxis is ineffective and shouldn't be used. Well, that's not actually correct either. But apart from that brief mention, the government really doesn't want people talking about homeopathic immunisation. You know, as I mentioned, I think maybe before we started, that most of the people that I see who contact me for homeopathic immunisation have never heard of homeopathy before. They're not natural medicine people necessarily at all. It's just their mums and dads who have become increasingly concerned about the potential problems associated with vaccination. They may have seen their own children or children of their friends or relatives being affected by vaccines. They may know parents with autistic children and hear their story about how they lost eye contact within a week of being vaccinated, or their language, which was starting to progress, suddenly regressed. Things like this. You know, parents aren't stupid. Unfortunately, they're given very little credit for common sense, but parents have a lot of common sense. And if you find that something fundamentally changes in the well-being of your child within a week of an invasive medical procedure, it doesn't take an awful lot of grey matter to actually realise that there's probably a connection. And when you see that happening in hundreds, and in America in thousands, tens of thousands of children, you know, that's why parents are concerned. The government does not give them credit for doing research, for not taking the word of people who are trained in pharmaceutical medicine and who are benefited by pharmaceutical medicine, by not taking their word, but by doing their own research. And I'm sure that many of the parents listening to your show are exactly in that situation. People who are not prepared to take the word of the pharmaceutical establishment and instead want to find out for themselves as much information to make informed decisions. And you see, that's really where I come from, and for the work that I've been doing for the last 30 years. I don't tell parents that they should use homeoprophylaxis or they shouldn't. I don't tell them that they should or shouldn't use vaccination. What I say to parents is you have a choice. And the choice is between two methods of disease-specific prevention. Both of them appear, based on evidence, to have similar levels of protection, around that sort of 90% mark as a kind of a working average. But one of the methods is potentially toxic and the other one isn't. So parents have a choice. But you know, the real heart of this whole discussion comes back to evidence of effectiveness. there's no point in having something that's safe, that will do no harm, if it doesn't work. Therefore, the onus has been on me as an advocate for this method to produce evidence that it does work. And so that's why I've spent 30 years collecting data from my own research, but even more importantly, from the work that people around the world are doing, and more recently in the last decade from, you know, people, particularly in Cuba and India, where it's being used now, as I said before, in these massive numbers of people and being used by governments. So there is evidence. So if a person who's using homeoprophylaxis, what I always say to mums and dads who use it is that if you're ever involved in a conversation with a doctor, a nurse, family members, members of the public about this, and these conversations can become quite difficult and heated, what I say to mums and dads is start with a point of agreement and say to the other person, we totally believe that we should try and protect our children against potentially serious infectious diseases, not necessarily everything, but certainly against those potentially serious diseases. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're immunising our children as well. It's just that we're using a different method of immunisation to what you're using. And then if the other person says, oh, it's a lot of rubbish, there's no evidence, it's nonsense, the NHMRC has said this or that, they can then say very politely, well, actually, there is a lot of evidence. Clearly, you're not aware of it, but if you do a bit of research, you'll find that this method has not only been used for over 200 years, but is being used by governments around the world and is being implemented by orthodox medical people, orthodox scientists. Dr. Bracho is not a GP. He's actually an expert in vaccine adjuvants. And he's actually now moved to Australia. He's working in Adelaide on nanoparticles. And many people believe nanoparticles may be the place where eventually the orthodox explanation of homeopathy in general will be found.
Okay, interesting.
Right.
Did you want from that point, was that a segue into a discussion of the possible mechanisms involved? Because I did want to ask about that at some point as to how it actually works.
Yeah. As we were chatting beforehand, it's not an easy thing to explain in orthodox medical terms because the orthodox paradigm does not recognize energy in the way that natural medicines do, and particularly homeopathic medicines, because, as I mentioned before, homeopathic medicines usually, not always, but usually are prepared past the point of Avogadro's number. So there's no molecules of the original substance left. But every substance on the planet has an energetic profile. A measles virus is a thing. You can send it away to a laboratory and they'll tell you, yes, that's a measles virus. But that has an energetic profile as well. Now, our immune systems, when we're talking about defense against infectious diseases, have 3 lines of defense. The last line of defense, which kicks in about 3 or 4 days after infection, is the antigen-antibody line of defense. Before that, there are lines of defense in the respiratory tract and the gastrointestinal tract, because most infectious diseases, not all of them, but most, enter through the nose and the mouth. So those lines of defense have been built up over thousands of years. It's why, for example, when we used to use oral polio vaccine, that recently vaccinated children put others at risk because they would excrete through the feces some of the virus. Because a healthy child, when you put a bit of virus down the mouth, these mechanisms of action jump into play, whether they're vaccinated or not, jump into play, and the way to get rid of it is to expel it through the feces. But there's a first line of defense, which we can call the energetic line of defense. It's the level of predisposition or susceptibility. So instead of giving a modified bit of antigen or disease material, as is done with vaccines, what we're doing is introducing the energetic profile of the substance that we're trying to prevent. And so let's say, for example, the measles virus. So we're using a potency of the measles virus, or we're using a substance when we talk about genus epidemicus remedies, which has a symptom profile similar to the symptom profile caused by measles. And that's how the law of similars can be used. So when you introduce an energetic profile that resonates, that's very similar to the energetic profile of measles, it will cause changes at the most subtle level of our immune system. It will, in a way, prime the energetic part of the immune system so that when it's exposed to the measles virus, the first level of exposure is energetic before the physical reactions kick in. If you can make the person immune at that first level, then the so-called physical reactions that orthodox people call the disease will not happen. Now, that's the conceptual picture. To give you a little analogy, if a person's susceptible to, say, rust tox trees, and they're out on the golf course and there's a rust tox tree 100 meters away, they don't even need to brush up against it, it's very likely they'll break out in a red, hot, blotchy, itchy rash, because that's what susceptibility to rust tox causes. If you then give that person a homeopathic potency of rust tox, the next time they're out on the golf course, they almost certainly won't get that red, blotchy, itchy rash once again, even if they're close to the tree or not close to it, because you've changed the level of predisposition or susceptibility. So with homeoprophylaxis, instead of giving potencies of rust tox, we're giving potencies of measles virus, whooping cough bacteria, whatever. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it's very helpful, and I would add that based on where I'm coming from, if you talk about the fact that where physics is now is the simple reality of, well, our reductionist approach has taken us down to the point where the most fundamental particles are nothing but waves. They're vortexes of, it's literally just the fabric of space twisting in on itself. So there is actually no matter. So it's completely legitimate to talk in terms of energy, because what we think of as matter is actually just patterns of energy anyway. So it sounds to me like what a homeopathic remedy is a quantum field being introduced into the body's bioholographic quantum field, and it's an information exchange, and there's a recoding that goes on there. So I think that it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I know 10 years ago, homeopaths were getting very excited and saying quantum mechanics is going to explain homeopathy. And then I went to a lecture by a Dr. Schulte, I think his name was, who was actually an expert on quantum mechanics and who knew a lot about homeopathy. And he said, given our knowledge of quantum mechanics at the moment, it's not going to explain homeopathy in the near future. The most likely explanations seem to be coming from two fields: people who are working with the memory of water, and people who are working in the area of nanoparticles. I'm not an expert in either of those, and I am not going to even try and explain the work that's being done at the moment. It's more intelligent people than I can do that job. But yeah, somewhere along the line, there's going to be an explanation which is understandable to the majority of orthodox scientists. Now, it'll never be understandable to all of them, because some of them are so close-minded. You're going to literally need a new generation, an old generation to die and a new generation to be born and come into it for that to happen. So whether it'll happen in my lifetime, I've got less time to go than you guys. So whether it'll happen in my lifetime, I don't know. God willing, it will. But all I can do, you see, I don't usually try and explain how homeoprophylaxis works. I just try and show evidence that it does work. Because even if we can't understand whether it works, we can understand that it does work by looking at evidence. So if you look at evidence of effectiveness, you can actually show in tangible terms to any reasonable-minded person that yes, we do have evidence that it works, significant evidence. Now, you may not be able to show that to a person who's not reasonably minded, but you can't please everyone.
That's right. You just be wasting your time, really.
Absolutely. I don't engage in arguments with skeptics.
Yeah.
It's just a complete waste of energy.
Yeah, yeah. I sit with you on that one, in that I don't really it does not affect me at all to understand how it works. I couldn't care less how it works. All I know is that it works, and if it works, why not use it?
Yep, that's fair enough. That's a very practical, pragmatic way of looking at it, for sure.
But you want to know, like your brain is
I'm
your
sorry.
brain's
I'm
different
sorry
to
for
mine.
wanting to
No, don't be sorry.
No.
We're just different.
It's just interesting. Like,
Yeah.
if you're someone who likes the conceptual aspect as well as the nuts and bolts, does it work? I mean, I accept that it works, no doubt. There's no doubt about it. But I just find it a stimulating thing to go into possible mechanisms of action with this kind of thing, because it's so alien to our standard ways of thinking about medicine or healing. Of course, if you're curious about that, you want to know, well, okay, what might be going on here, and what are the newest fringe concepts on the leading edge of physics, or water memory by quantum this and that. What's going on here, and what are they saying? And you mentioned water memory, and I think that came up in relation to homeopathy when we spoke to Gerald Pollack, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, you might find his interview interesting, but yeah, it's very much. I'm really a pragmatist when it comes to what's happening out in the world. Like, we have situations that need to be dealt with. You can't logically make the argument, if you are a so-called skeptic, you can't make the argument we shouldn't use it because we don't understand how it works. The question isn't how. The question is, does it work? Because the so-called cavemen weren't rubbing sticks together and making fire and going, oh, wow, this is incredible. Oh, but how does it work? Oh, we don't know. Oh, well, it's baloney. It doesn't exist. They used the fire.
Absolutely. Well, there's a very good analogy in Orthodox medicine. We used aspirin for 4 decades without knowing how it worked, without knowing its mechanism of action. But people knew that it did work. It did have a particular physiological effect. You see, Brendan, what you've just done is give the attitude of a true scientist. So a true scientist will look at the real world and look at what happens dispassionately in the real world. And if something that happens doesn't make sense according to the current paradigm, the true scientist will then say, okay, this is really interesting. Let's go and try and find out why. But unfortunately, the scientists that are bred under pharmaceutical medicine, they don't ask that question. That is as to how the world operates. And anything outside of that, I think they treat with fear and suspicion. And, I'm often asked, why don't people in Orthodox medicine embrace homeopathy and look at all the evidence that's there and say, wow, this could be really useful. Let's use it. Well, by the way, doctors trained in Orthodox science medicine, they do that, because around the world, there are hundreds of thousands of Orthodox GPs who use homeopathy. So we're, talking about Australia and America principally, when we're talking about very close-minded groups of scientists. But if they were real scientists, they'd be saying, okay, we have massive amounts of data here. We have massive amounts of evidence. Let's try and work out why this is happening. It doesn't make sense to our normal paradigm, but we can actually extend science by working out how. We'll find out something new, something we don't know now. And for most people, that should be really exciting. I did a seminar with Dr. Peter Gliddens this morning, and the comment he made at this point was, yeah, whoever works this out, that's Nobel Prize stuff. And it is. This Orthodox scientists who can work out the explanation for homeopathy, they will be expanding the scientific paradigm immensely, and it will lead to so many breakthroughs in so many other areas. Of course, Big Pharma won't be happy because you can't sell, well, they'll try to, but you can't sell energy. You can't sell homeopathy in the sense that you can't patent it. and then make it exclusive and then charge a huge amount of money for it, even though it costs very little to make. And the same will apply with much of energy healing, which they will not be able to manage in the way they can with chemical healing. But we don't want to get sidetracked into conspiracy theories. They're actually not theories, they're facts, but we'll call them conspiracy facts. We don't want to get sidetracked into that too much.
No, well, okay. I was going to mention to you a trend that we've observed, and, you know, not wanting to get bogged down in it, but I thought I might get a comment from you if you would indulge me. The trend is that in Australia in particular, over the last couple of years, the heat has been turned up big time against alternative therapies in general. Like, there's a concerted effort to really make life as difficult as possible for these practitioners. I was wondering if you've noticed that yourself, and if you have anything to say, not to insult your intelligence.
Yeah, I've noticed it more for my colleagues. I mean, I'm old enough now and have been around for long enough to not be worried too much about it, but I certainly feel for new practitioners starting out in any form of complementary medicine, their belief in what they've learnt and, you know, the form of medicine that they're going to use is being sorely tested, because they are being described with a whole lot of very negative adjectives by these people. There is a group of people in the scientific community who are just openly hostile to all forms of complementary medicine. Now, once again, one can only speculate as to the reason why. It's interesting, I was reading this afternoon about the new laws that are proposed in California, which will prevent children from attending school unless they're completely vaccinated. And they're being proposed by a number of members of Congress. And the main advocate, Dr. Pan, I think his name, or Congressman Pan, P-A-N, I think it is. One of the things that was noted about him was that he was paid $85,000 by the pharmaceutical lobby. So, you know, in America, it's blatant. I don't think in Australia, I hope that it's not like that in Australia. It may be, that's certainly not blatant, but I don't think it's just a matter of, you know, money. I think it's more a case of prestige and the fear of losing this sort of control that this group of high-level medical people and scientists have in the country, because they do have. This particular group had an immense impact on the NHMRC investigation. And in fact, one of the committee that undertook the homeopathic investigation was a member of this group. They had to resign prior to taking up the NHMRC appointment. But that just shows how biased the analysis was from the start. But this group has the ear of politicians. And the average politician has no idea about health.
No.
To be honest with you, they take advice from the health department, and that's understandable. In theory, the health department should be the best people to advise our politicians, who will then make wise decisions about our health. Unfortunately, the whole stream of advice has been corrupted, and it's very, very disappointing. But that's the way it is. I really, as I said, believe a big part of it is fear that if they acknowledge that complementary medicine is successful, not just homeopathy, but all forms of complementary medicine. But homeopathy, of course, is the extreme case because it uses energetic medicine. They would have to change their paradigm.
Yeah.
You see, the amazing thing is when you look, for example, at herbal medicine and you look at Europe, there are a huge number of studies published in Europe about the effectiveness of herbal medicine and nutritional medicine. Now, these studies aren't published in English, so the NHMRC will exclude them from their analysis because they conveniently only accept articles published in English. But these are orthodox randomized controlled trials. That's what I mean by studies. These are studies done to the same degree of rigor, in fact, probably more rigorous than many studies done on drugs. So, you know, when they come to attack all forms of complementary medicine, they're on really, really weak ground there because of their body of orthodox evidence supporting this form of medicine. But they're still going to go ahead with the attack because this group is absolutely relentless. Whatever their motivation, whether it's fear or greed or whatever, they are absolutely relentless. And parents have to be aware of that and deal with it.
It's obviously for the world of alternative practitioners and researchers, it's difficult to get to influence the paradigm or to evolve it, because that those parties are so entrenched in the system, and you guys are not entrenched in the system. So that's the first sort of stumbling block, if you like. It's hard to just get a hearing at all. But is it a question also partially of researchers and scientists, practitioners like yourself, not being as well organized, so it is more difficult to start penetrating in there? Like we have the think tanks and the groups in the establishment. Do we have the equivalents outside in your world?
We do, but they certainly don't have the influence of the pharmaceutical think tanks, etc. I mean, one reason is because of funding.
Yeah.
The funding from big pharma is almost unlimited, whereas funding from homeopathy manufacturers is, very, very minimal. But there are some very good groups in Australia and around the world. You see, when you go to a country like India, it's totally different. The homeopaths do have the ear, right up to the Prime Minister, who's a fan of homeopathy. Dr. Modi uses homeopathy. And he was the one who established, as an independent department, the Department of Ayush. So that stands for Ayurveda, Yoga and Naturopathy, Urani, US Siddhi, and H is homeopathy.
Awesome.
So the Department of Ayush sits at equal level as the orthodox or the allopathic or pharmaceutical medicine in the Indian health system. So, around the world, homeopathy is known. In fact, the World Health Organization did an atlas, what they called an atlas of homeopathy, which was, of traditional complementary and alternative medicine, which they published in 2007. And what it showed was they split the world into two parts, the upper gross domestic product and the lower gross domestic product half. In the upper half, homeopathy was the most commonly used form of TCAM, and in the lower half, it was the second most commonly used form of TCAM. So, homeopathy is not known and not supported in Australia very much, but around the world, 500 million people are using it right now. So all it needs is politicians to be made aware of this. And so their focus, it goes outside of our country. What we need is a voice on the floor of Parliament. And there is work being done to that effect. And I hope I might have some interesting things for you to tell you in 6 months.
Awesome.
Yes, that sounds awesome. We really
sound with a little bit of mystery.
Yes. Is that so we have to invite you back now?
Absolutely. I expect an invitation back in 6 months, and I'll tell you all about
it in the calendar,
new developments.
Lock it in. It's locked in. Awesome. We'd love to hear some good news. That'd be outstanding for a change.
Yes, good.
Yeah.
I'd love to get back on track about homeoprophylaxis and the specifics of your program and what it involves and that kind of thing, so that parents are aware of what it is. Okay,
so I have two basic programs. One is for long-term protection against the common diseases in Australia, and the other is for short-term protection, mainly for overseas travel. Although if people are going to an area where there's an outbreak, say, of whooping cough, and they want short-term coverage, we can do that. So homeoprophylaxis can be used for both short-term and long-term prevention. For my long-term program, basically it starts at 1 month of age, and a different remedy is given every month, once a month, for the first 10 months, and then every third month, every fourth month, every 6th month, over a 7-year period. So there's a lot of gaps in the program along the way. Most people start late, and the instructions tell people that they can catch up just by ignoring the gaps, keeping on giving monthly doses until their child's age reaches the age of the program, and then they just follow the age of the program for the remainder. So this program comes in a kit form, and effectively the cost is about $20 a year. So it's very inexpensive. I mean, this is one of the blessings of homeopathy. We could make it a lot more expensive, but, you know, it isn't. The short-term prevention, if it's for overseas travel, I always tell people to try and start a month before they leave, because normally I give a dose once a fortnight for each individual disease, different remedy for each disease. And it's good to have 2 doses before you leave for the trip. So if you start a month before you go, that'll give you a couple of doses before you hit the area of concern. And once again, it's very flexible. If a person's going just for 2 or 3 weeks, that's fine. If they're going on an extended overseas trip, we may need to devise a strategy where they'll use some remedies for part of the trip, and when they go to different countries, they use different remedies for other parts. Now, for people who are after information about this, I've got 4 main books. One which has only just recently been published. Actually, I've got a book that was translated into Chinese by some lovely ladies in Hong Kong some years ago. And then they asked me if I'd do a very simple little introduction for parents that they could translate into Chinese as well. So that's just been released. And it's on Amazon, as is a book that I wrote for practitioners of any modality, telling them how to implement these homeoprophylaxis programs. It's called A Complete Practitioner's Manual of Homeoprophylaxis. The main book for parents who don't mind a bit of information, a bit of technical data. It's not easy reading, and it's, you know, that thick, but it's called Vaccination and Homeoprophylaxis, a Review of Risks and Alternatives. I also have a book of statistics for those rare people who just love statistics and to look at the raw data from my doctoral research, and that's called Homeoprophylaxis, a 15-year clinical study. And also I have a book called Vaccine Damaged Children, Treatment, Prevention, Reasons, which was published in 2010. And it talks about the use of homeopathic potencies of vaccines to help cure some of the long-term chronic diseases caused by vaccines. I've also got a couple of web-based courses. One's for parents, 4 sessions, and another one's for practitioners over 12 sessions. Now, these use a Camtasia format where the person gets like a PowerPoint presentation. There's a little box down the bottom corner with me lecturing to the PowerPoint, and then it's not a webinar, so they can go on and access it whenever they want to. They can subscribe and then come back 6 months later and look at it again, and they have the facility to ask me questions through email. So they're the resources which I've put together for parents who want to get different degrees of information. My webpage, for those who'd like to note it down, because there's also information just freely available on the webpage, is 3 W's, homestudy, HOMSTUDY.net. So unfortunately, some people put in an extra E and say home study. Well, it's not home study, it's homestudy.net. And you've got an access to my email there, which is admin@homestudy.net for people who are interested, who would like a bit more information. But I usually say to folks, have a look on the website first. Those different sorts of evidence we talked about, you know, the 4 different types of evidence, that's summarized on the web page. So people who haven't been scribbling madly can just go there and have a look at a brief summary. And if they want to get more detailed information, they can look on the publications page, or they can access the web-based courses, and they can find whatever they need there.
Awesome, thank you. I've got quite a few friends with kids on what they call the golden program, and it's like a little little thing that's known.
An insider's joke.
Yeah.
Well, I hope it is a golden program.
Yeah. Now, I'd love to talk about, you just touched there on your book, Vaccine Damaged Children. I would love to go into what you just touched on just there about the use of the vaccine to heal if you'd like
Are
to
we
go.
able to do that at another time? Because
We
I'm
could.
starting to get close to
Okay.
needing to go. Sorry
Why
to be
don't-
practical.
That's okay. Why don't we
Yeah,
have a
this will
separate
take a long
show about
time.
that? Yeah, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
I have a bit of a personal I don't know, bias with that because I was damaged by vaccines. So I would like to know more about that. Anyway.
Yeah, look, I'd be very happy in a few months' time if you'd
Yeah.
like to make a session talking about the treatment of vaccine damaged children. I'm just at the process of finalising 2 web-based courses on that as well.
Wow.
One for parents and another one for practitioners. So hopefully in a few months' time, if we have a chat, then I might be able to tell you about those as well. But yeah, we don't have enough time to do it justice, and I think it deserves its own little chat. Actually, it's such an important thing.
Yeah.
I agree.
Looking at the data there and what we can do. Yep.
Awesome.
Very much so.
Because there are a lot of people out there who have been left in the lurch by this and, aren't really sure what to do, and they're clutching at straws trying to figure out how they can, heal themselves and heal their children. And let's do that. Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. That'd be lovely.
Yeah.
I'd love that very much.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation and got a lot out of it. Please do share it with someone who you know will benefit from that material. And if you want to find more of Dr. Golden's work, you can head to homstudy.au. It's homstudy.au. And he's got courses and publications and all sorts of stuff there. If you want to support myself on Substack, official Brendan Murphy. And if you want to check out my partner Amy's writing, her Substack is Amy Q Devlin, and it's AIMEEQ Devlin. Check us out. That's where our long form content is. Obviously, you've also got the option of joining Truthiversity with me and going for a deeper dive, getting all the multimedia stuff and what have you, and all the complete podcast episodes. And in the meantime, enjoy your further researches into homeopathy, and let's share the love. Thanks for tuning in. Catch you next time.